Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about where do we place unilateral or one-legged training in a strength program. Because it's something that comes up, and it's something that I see that gets done as a lot of goof-off exercises, and there's a difference between doing it because you need it for your programming purposes and due to recovery and weak point training versus someone who does it because they're basically too lazy to build their squat and deadlift and things up. There's a difference between the two. Furthermore, some of it is much, much more difficult than others. Like you'll see people who do little light stuff off of a fairly low bench. They don't have a super deep range of motion. And they'll do fluff variations of some of these things. Like they'll step up onto a little low block. And that might be fine if you're someone who can't train and you're just starting out in the gym and you struggle with even squatting your body. You know, stepping up onto a little low step up might be useful for developing your base for a week or two, right? It might be useful for that. But ideally, those people need to be getting under a barbell. They need to be getting under a barbell. And what people need to look at, there's a big, big difference between doing something like that versus stepping up onto a 20-inch box like I'm doing with a safety bar. Because that bar alone is 65 pounds before I even add the little plates to it. This is what one-legged supplemental work looks like for a 500 plus pound squatter. And you need to know this is supplemental work. It's supplemental work. So the problem is that people will push one-legged training at the exclusion of doing real work, and then again, I would much rather see this sort of stuff than people get on a leg press. I'm not a big fan of the leg press, but that's its own topic. It's just because of the fact that the leg press is so easy to load that people get scared of weights and think they're working hard still when they're not really doing so. Because you spend so much energy loading and unloading the machine, and it can put stress on the low back in ways it's not good. It takes so much of your time loading the machine that it's basically cardio. And usually guys will get up there and they think that 1,000 pounds on the leg press is something strong, and it's not. That's literally 110 pound girl weights. Like there are women out there who could rep out 1,000 pounds on a leg press. So when you look at it from that perspective, that's really not a good exercise. It really isn't. But things like this for people who need supplemental leg work, they have value. They have a lot more value. But why would we even do something like this? And people say, why wouldn't you just squat more? Well, because we reach a threshold to where, number one, we can develop certain unilateral imbalances. And usually, though, those are less common for people who do lower body work the way I do it. I put a heavy focus these days on the box squat and the sumo deadlift. Right? Those are my primary movements. The wide stance involved with those lends itself to better athleticism and less muscle imbalances left to right. And of course, that's largely due to the fact that you have a very wide stance and you're pressing outward. So that actually makes you a little bit better at doing one-legged things sometimes because you're almost used to being pivoted on each foot like you would in a lot of sports and a lot of activities like that. So they're relatively useful for athletic strength, but the actual outward force instead of the forward force that you're doing with your toes tends to create a better left to right muscle balance because you're getting more even force production. So it tends to be less of an issue, but that is definitely a factor for why we might want to do unilateral stuff. Now, when we do unilateral stuff, it's not like what people think of, oh, we could just use a pair of dumbbells. A pair of dumbbells will never, ever, ever fix a unilateral imbalance. And again, people tend to focus on little fluffy exercises also that don't build much muscle when they do dumbbells instead of thinking, well, maybe I need to do stuff one arm at a time, starting with the weak side. Right? And in this case, this is the same sort of thing. So in my case, I know that my left leg is the weaker leg. Not by much. It's not by much at all. So we do the one-legged leading with that leg. You know, we could also apply the same thing to a one-legged deadlift, couldn't we? Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, some of this will kind of tell you what's going on with your unilateral strength. Because if you have a strength imbalance, not only are you more predisposed to injuries, you're not as strong as you could be. So doing some of this stuff to make sure every now and then isn't a bad idea for the more advanced lifter. And then you can shore up those weaknesses, because you want your quad and hip and hamstring and everything to be fairly evenly balanced in terms of strength, because again, you're going to have a lower chance of injury, but also you're going to be stronger. If you're so deficient in one of your legs that it's capable of producing 20% less force than the other one, your squat and deadlift are probably 10% lower than they could be. Like, that's unacceptable. So we have that to factor in. But what is the other big factor? Well, there's a much, much larger factor at play than that. It's that we can only handle so much of the big exercises. Again, when you train really hard with a lot of volume with heavy weight, we can only handle so much axial loading. You can only handle so much heavy weight sitting up on top of your back. Now, in my case, I do a lot of box squats, a lot of deadlifts. I do a lot of stuff with chains and bands. So I'm used to having a very heavy weight on my back quite frequently. And even because of the bands and the chains, even my speed work could be a lot. So if you're an athlete in a situation like that, and you find that your quads are simply still lagging, they're your weak link. Because we all have weak links. And when people hear that, they'll say, well, what do you mean a weak link? You're a pretty strong dude. Watching you squat over 500 pounds. Well, yeah, but I still have weak links, right? We all have weak links. The strongest man in the world has a weak muscle somewhere in his body that's weaker relative to his other muscles. And if we want to be as strong and athletic as possible, we need to always work on our weaknesses, right? Strengthening your weaknesses is the fastest way and the most efficient way to get overall stronger and better. And that applies to every sport. I don't care what you compete in. I don't care what your goals are. That is universally a true statement. So in the case of someone like me, my quads are my limiting factor in my squat, right? There's a reason I don't squat 600 pounds right now. It's because I don't have 600-pound squatter quads. So we work on these things. They need extra work, but I can't handle more squatting and deadlifting than I handle every week. And I'm on set programming for those things. So when you're running set programming, everything else has to be either smaller hypertrophy exercises or conditioning work. So basically, in my case, all of my max effort and speed work and everything else is programmed. The volume and intensity levels are programmed already. They don't deviate. Those stay consistent based upon my relative strength on a weekly basis. Extra work is supplemental. So in this case, a one-legged exercise allows us to add a lot more training volume in a way that's easier to recover from. And you take a one-legged exercise like this, and it puts you into a deep squat position, right? You're in a deep squat position. It's not a little low step up. This is pretty high up. Puts an enormous amount of tension on the lower quad. It's an enormous amount of tension on it when you're at the bottom. Well, that's usually your weakest link in the quad in a deep squat. And it carries over, and you're moving your body through space. Moving your body through space, and you can get up to some relatively heavy loads, because you got to remember your entire body weight's on there. It's not distributed halfway like it is on a squat. But you also don't have the same spinal compression that you do on a squat or a deadlift. Because in my case, I've got 70 pounds up on my back. That's nothing. I can squat over 500 pounds. So there is no real negative in terms of axial loading on something like this. But it puts an enormous amount of tension on the quads, and even the hips and the glutes. So it's very easy to recover from, and we can do a lot of training volume. The upside of it is that it has a metabolic conditioning component. I mean, you do 10 reps of this, 5 sets of 10 on each leg like this, back and forth, right? There's a cardiovascular component. So people would say, well, what about a more novice lifter? They don't need that from a recovery. Well, they could add this into their metabolic conditioning. And I do that also. You guys see me do that several days a week. I do these with just body weight as part of circuit training. I do these with body weight as part of circuit training. And a novice lifter could do that, and they would be just fine. Because usually your general physical preparedness is going to cause muscle growth throughout your entire body, along with building your conditioning. So a lift like this also, at least with body weight, can absolutely have its place in your Metcon work, which I think most people need to be doing. Uh, Again, controversial topic, but I happen to think that. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.